So just a heads up, it's been a little while since I've done one of these looks into an indie game that most people probably haven't played despite its really positive reception, so just a reminder that I'm going to be talking about spoilers for pretty much all of Umurangi Generation. And while the game isn't too focused on its narrative or reliant on any big twists, the way it slowly unspools what's going on with its environmental storytelling could arguably be undercut if you know where the whole thing is going, and I'd recommend playing it first if it at all interests you. With that out of the way, Umurangi Generation is a photography game released in May of 2020, with a DLC pack released in November that same year. You play as a young freelance photographer in a dystopian cyberpunk New Zealand who makes most of their scratch selling your photos to an undisclosed buyer. On each level, you're given a list of 7 things to take photos of, and it's up to you to find them. Because the game encourages artful experimentation, there are often multiple versions of an item allowing for multiple different photos. For example, on the second level of the game, you're asked to take a photo of a sarcastic "Property of the UN" slogan. One instance can be seen on this soldier's helmet, but it can also be seen in this graffiti on the wall. Either counts towards the objective, and you can take the photo of them in pretty much any way you want. Desaturated, artful, black and white image, or just a blurry snap of the one bit you need to reach your goal. Sometimes, though, the game asks you to use a specific type of lens, both to vary the gameplay and to get you to experiment with and learn about other lenses. Getting a picture of a cat and a bird together in Karikari, for example, is harder with the narrow field of view of a telephoto lens than with a standard lens, and it changes how you have to approach thinking about lining up that shot. As you explore and find the various items, the one thing the game asks is that you avoid taking photos of blue bottle jellyfish. Why? Well, for one thing, it's fun to have a thing to try to keep out of the frame in addition to trying to find things to put in it, but it's also there for thematic reasons, and we'll come back to that. When you complete all 7 objectives, you can head to the exit to deliver your parcel, and upon completing the level, you'll not only unlock the next area, but also a new piece of camera equipment.
Congratulations.
This could be a new lens, a gadget like a flash that can override ambient lighting conditions, a new setting to adjust the photo in post like saturation or hue, or even new movement mechanics that allow you to get to more places and have a wider variety of possible shots. So as you play the game, you're actually unlocking an entire palette of photography options, and the amount of ways to use your camera to capture a moment just keeps increasing. This makes revisiting old areas exciting, not because there's necessarily anything new in the level itself, but because a new lens, or post-processing slider, or ability to move to new places you couldn't before, can really change what you think of an area's potential for photographs. And Umurangi Generation very much wants you to express yourself. All photos are saved to your hard drive, or memory card in the case of the Switch version, and are meant to be shared. There's a system that determines how much your purchaser will pay for a photo, but I really wouldn't call it a scoring system, and the game makes no judgment about what a good photo really is, just that its scavenger hunt items are in frame and taken with the right lens. Everything else is personal style, a matter of aesthetics. But to really unlock the full suite of tools available, you need to complete an even harder set of objectives on each level that will grant you an additional camera gizmo. To get the second item, you need to not only photograph all 7 objectives, but also recreate a postcard image at a specific location on the map, get a photo with all of your friends in frame, earn a sufficient amount of money from your various photos, and find all of the extra film hidden around a level in less than 10 minutes and all in a single run. This isn't hard, per se, especially once you've memorized where the film can be found and have favorite places to easily snap each of the objectives. But it does require you to play with a mindset that is kind of orthogonal to the chill, creative vibe the mechanics otherwise seem to invite. And it feels like an intentional, if minor part of the game's commentary. Umurangi Generation doesn't spend a lot of time ruminating on your gig economy photography job, but I do think the way the game requires you to involve yourself in a process that puts productivity and punctuality ahead of expression and creativity in order to get stuff definitely underscores a tension between art and commerce. What's really clever about the game's hide-and-seek mechanics, though, is the way it allows the game to invest fully in its hands-off narrative approach. Umurangi Generation doesn't have an opening crawl with backstory, extended dialogue between characters, or audio logs that describe what's happening. Instead, it tells its tale 100% through environmental storytelling. And in and of itself, that's not all that new or exciting. Environmental storytelling has been around for ages at this point. But what's clever about Umurangi Generation is that it makes looking at the environment for little details the core thrust of the game's systems, and thus learning about and exploring the narrative becomes a natural part of the experience of playing it. Because it's a game about taking photos, it is a game that necessitates you pay attention to your environment. And it's not just the framing and taking of photos that contribute to this, it's also the scavenger hunt. You will be looking at graffiti and people and the detritus in the corner of a room and the neon signs on the walls, all while searching for the objects you need to line up for a shot or to find the phrase you need to photograph, so it's difficult to play this game and not pick up on its core themes and narrative progression. So let's talk about that. And this is where I give one last warning for spoilers, so if you think the game sounds fun and want to go in blind, maybe dip out now. You wouldn't immediately know it from the marketing or even the first few levels of the game, but Umurangi Generation is a game about the end of the world. As you play the game, it becomes clear that this cyberpunk version of Aotearoa is dealing with some ongoing disaster. You can see that the city of Tauranga is walled off in the opening level as fighter jets fly overhead. There are occupying UN troops everywhere, there are memorials to previous waves of disaster, and then, halfway through the game, there's a level where the troops are firing at something off in the distance. It's dark and it's unclear what it is they're shooting at, but if you take a photo and then raise the exposure all the way up, you see an enormous, horrible monster. The form that the end of the world takes in Umurangi Generation is a kaiju, a giant monster of the Godzilla or Gamera variety, although this one is less lizard and more of a mutated bluebottle jellyfish. But it's not a game about kaiju, or even the end of the world itself, per se. It's a game about how neoliberalism handles disasters, or more specifically, how it doesn't. In late 2019 and early 2020, before the COVID-19 pandemic had really begun to be a global phenomenon in earnest, the big story was the bushfires that were sweeping across Australia, particularly in the state of New South Wales. When all was said and done, 103,000 square miles of terrain had been burned, an area a little bigger than the state of Indiana and a little smaller than the country of South Korea. 1 billion animals are estimated to have died, including a third of the koala population in New South Wales. 34 people died, and almost 3,000 homes had been destroyed. Among the houses lost to the blaze was the home of the mother of Umurangi Generation's developer, Neftali Faulkner, aka Veselikov. In a speech at the 2020 Parallels event hosted by the Free Play Independent Games Festival, he mentions that the thing which disturbed him the most wasn't just the devastation of the fires, but the response to it.
The scariest thing for me was seeing how predictable neoliberalism talked about this. If you noticed, after the bushfires, and for all the international viewers, after this COVID thing came out, there was a lot of talking around the issue. So these posters, they're mentioning the fire, but they're not mentioning what caused the fire, which was climate change. And yes, the science is already in on that.
The fires are what gave the game its title. Umurangi is Terreo for red sky. Quoting an interview with him on Vice, quote, "I chose Umurangi Generation, Red Sky Generation, because the idea was to talk about how our generation is coming of age at the moment having to deal with older generations destroying the earth in front of us. And we can't really do anything about it. We can go and protest, sure, but in terms of being the people who actually push the buttons, we're limited in that space. The idea in choosing that title was that someday there is going to be a last generation, a generation who is in the position we're in at the moment. They're going to have to just sit by and watch. There's going to be a point where we can't fix it, a generation that won't have the same hope that I have at the moment." End quote. In some ways, Umurangi Generation actually follows in the environmental tradition of other photography games. The mechanic of taking photos lends itself to this. Animals are dynamic things to take photos of, and landscapes are pretty. Excluding horror titles like Fatal Frame or Dead Rising, and the occasional anime panty shot game that takes photography games in a very different direction, the theme of nature in photography games seems almost as omnipresent as trauma in horror games. And this emphasis on photographing nature has given rise to a naturalist sentiment that runs through much of the genre, sometimes passively and sometimes less so. Pokemon Snap embraces a biologist's approach to photography, documenting the types of animals in different regions and their behavior. Indie games like Penko Park play on the same exploring nature vibe, giving you the opportunity to document the fictional wild animals that populate its world. Eastshade tasks you with painting portraits of anthropomorphic animals and its lush, verdant island vistas. Africa, a PlayStation 3 photography game, asked players to take photos of real-world wildlife while on safari. And there are plenty of smaller titles focused on taking photos of specific animals. Tory Pond has you photographing adorable birds, and the upcoming Paparazzi has you taking photos of dogs. Shutter Stroll invites players to walk around procedurally generated islands without any real objective and just take pictures of anything that they find beautiful or interesting. Alba is perhaps the closest in the genre to Umurangi Generation thematically. It's a game about photographing animals that live on your small island in order to build awareness, gain signatures, and prevent a bird sanctuary from being bulldozed and a beachfront hotel being built in its place. The point is that photography games sort of lend themselves to a celebration of nature one way or the other, from a scientific perspective, an awe-inspiring beauty perspective, or a political perspective. But what makes Umurangi unique among these games is that while it's a photography game that is informed by environmental destruction, it isn't exactly what one would call an environmentalist or naturalist game. Instead of asking you to take photos of animals or landscapes, Umurangi Generation's photography takes place in urban environments and focuses on taking pictures of people and the places and objects that define their lives in a way that makes the failures of their society to handle these disasters evident. To quote Faulkner, he presents you with a shitty future. One that's driven by the failure of government to fix the problems and companies rushing to capitalize on the needs of people that are desperate for relief. And the game lets you draw your own conclusions about how things got to this place. Faulkner was acutely concerned with not having the game be didactic or preachy.
And I thought to myself, how can you talk about something that's happening right now with something like this and not just making it a shit show of like lame social commentary? And the place I think I arrived at is you go cyberpunk.
And I think he largely succeeded, primarily by presenting a world scarred beyond healing where life limps on anyway. For example, in Kadi Kadi, you hear constant gunfire and explosions in the distance. And you can see ads asking, "Sick of the noise? Soundproof your home!" Nothing in the world of Umurangi Generation can stop the kaiju, or the gunfire, or the encroaching end of times. But we can sell you a way to ignore the problem a little bit better. It's a game deeply informed by climate change, but not one about taking photos of the good things we're saving. It's about taking photos of where bad policy and broken systems lead us. There are echoes of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine here. The idea that in the wake of a disaster, capitalists can move in, privatize and deregulate as much as possible under the guise of helping a hurt community stabilize and return to normal as quickly as possible, extract all of the gains made by privatizing institutions out to other places, and claim that you're all doing it as an act of charity and goodwill. And disaster capitalism is in full swing in Umurangi Generation. The UN are an occupying force in Tauranga, who are despised by the local citizenry, and whose soldiers also don't seem to want to be there. Countless ads plaster the neon streets promoting all sorts of services to cope with the existential threat of giant monsters destroying your city. Movie posters come in seemingly three varieties: the fluffy escapist nonsense that asks you to ignore the problems, sappy melodramas that frame enduring the world's problems as a struggle to be proud of, or violent propaganda that frames American soldiers and the occupying UN military force by proxy as heroic. In the Strand, people are having a block party with street racing cars and video games, while just one road over, the entire area has been destroyed. A visit to Kadi Kadi shows you a memorial to the victims of the first kaiju attack in 2035, but surrounding that are hand-scrawled memorials to Maxine, a local girl who more recently sacrificed her life to save the area. The formal systems are no longer recognizing the dead. Those deaths have become normalized. Now only the place and people that knew Maxine mourn her. The system has moved on. And amid all of this destruction and death and gross capitalism, the Umurangi Generation just try to vibe. They know nothing but a world teetering on the brink of disaster, as if it's always been this way. So they throw block parties and hang out on rooftops and enjoy one another's company. They ostensibly have their whole lives ahead of them, but for now, they're young and free. And all of this crescendos in the final levels of the main game as you return to your hangout from the opening and see the kaiju standing next to Mount Moau. Across the bay, 3 giant robots open fire in defense of humanity. But it's all for naught. The end of the world has arrived to be witnessed by the Umurangi Generation, a bunch of kids who weren't even born when this disaster started and had to watch this get worse around them as the people in control ignored the problem, tried to capitalize on it, or tried to fight it in utterly ineffectual ways. So ends the original game's campaign. It's mostly mournful, quietly regretting the burdens of a generation that, hopefully, has yet to be born. But there are 4 additional levels in the macro DLC pack, and where the main game has a wistful tone that's passively contemptuous of those who would rather profit from than fix the world's problems, the DLC feels full of righteous anger. I suspect a lot of this has to do with the production schedule. The original Umurangi generation was released in May of 2020, after the bushfires, but only 3 months into the pandemic. But the macro DLC released that November, and that's an additional half a year of, say, Amazon releasing ads like this.
Right now, delivering the things people need has never been more important. To all of our Amazon retail heroes, on the floor, in the air, and behind the wheel, we want to thank you.
And then going on the offensive against the unionization efforts of their heroes and indignantly denying that their heroes are peeing in bottles due to the schedules they're asked to keep. It's also after a summer of protests and wanton police violence in the wake of George Floyd's death. A summer where we saw corporations that would freely state that they stand for a vague equality and that racism in the abstract is bad, but would never explicitly condemn police violence, let alone calling for defunding or demilitarization of the police.
I tell them, just be honest. Tell your customers that JP Morgan is against racism, in theory.
These examples feel very much like the same way Domino's won't mention climate change while raising money for bushfire relief. Suddenly, reality looked like it was doubling down on the shitty future envisioned by Umurangi generation, and the game's expansion feels frustrated by that fact. The DLC takes place 2 weeks prior to the events of the main game, and effectively establishes the reason your friend group was hanging out on the surface during the end of the world. Where the main game just hints at some Neon Genesis Evangelion influence with a penguin friend and kaiju and giant robots at the end of the game, the DLC actually goes further and establishes that most people live in an Eva-style underground city to shield them from the constant attacks above, and that there seems to be some class stratification between the poor surface dwellers and the more well-to-do population of the underground. You can see this right away in the Gamer's Palace level, where men in suits are waited on by pinup girls both real and virtual as the celebrity guest DJ Tariq spins records, while outside, your friends and others are forced to wait patiently as the city is in lockdown and huge explosions are heard in the distance. The party vibe of the inside falls away immediately. It also becomes clear that the game's become more blunt about its dystopia in the DLC. There's a clothing store called Topsiders that purports to sell grungy, surface-dweller clothing from the anti-establishment clothing company to the elites underground. And the hypocrisy of their appropriation of the trappings of poverty as a fashion statement is made apparent by way of their store's advertisement for police and anti-graffiti reminders. It's a bit less subtle than the main game, but there's also a sardonic frustration that comes through, like the video game equivalent of saying it louder for those in the back. The second level of the DLC takes place in one of the storage units for the Ava-like robots from the end of the main game. And there's plenty to snap photos of here, but there's one secret room that I think is maybe key to the DLC thematically. It's the only locked door that requires a keycard to open in the entire game, and when you get in there, the music changes to an ominous hum. And you see a giant, damaged mech with blue-bottle jellyfish and tentacles all over it. There are 2 body bags on the ground, the pilots of the mech. Then you remember the barracks in the same level. There were beds for a Reggie and a Loman, the names on the body bags. And the girl under Reggie's bunk was crying and being berated by what is presumably her superior officer in front of a poster forbidding fraternization among coworkers. And there were a pile of Polaroids at her feet, including one labeled ILY and a half-heart pendant marked JL. And a brief look around the room reveals that JL is Jane Loman, deceased. So, yeah, 2 dead pilots. But then you realized you passed an entire wall of names when you came in. Was it a memorial? Were all those names fallen mech pilots? And wait, Maxine, the girl who sacrificed her life to save Kari Kari? Some of the wall art showed her in a UN suit. Was she also a pilot that died? I think she might have been. Jesus, how many mechs are they losing? As you walk out of the room with the damaged mech and back to the rest of the hangar, you notice there are posters all over about how much ass you could kick if you sign up to fight with the UN, how death numbers by kaiju are down, and how we've almost got this thing licked. And you know, because you've played the main game to completion at this point, that that's not true. But now you realize they know they're losing. and they're hiding it. Beyond its criticism of the way neoliberal governments fail to handle disasters, Umurangi Generation is also concerned with the way in which media shapes the way we think. This is why you're not supposed to take photos of blue bottles. They're an omnipresent reminder of where things stand and where things are headed. And people just don't want to know. They don't want to think about it. So you're punished if you include them in your frame. They, the cause of the problem, are to be excised from the picture. You can capture the war against them, or the human suffering, or the boots on the ground reality of the setting, and you can definitely capture fun, goofy stuff like a cat and a bird, but you can't capture the problem. Like Faulkner said,
they're mentioning the fire, but they're not mentioning what caused the fire, which was climate change. And yes.
And this idea that the framing of media has power extends all the way to the final level of the DLC. It takes place at a protest against UN occupation and its accompanying excessive police violence. There are people doing a haka, and people holding signs and Maori flags, and tons of graffiti that read like Twitter discourse from the summer of 2020. There's anger about police violence, about the rise in fascism, about treating property like it's worth more than human lives, and about the failure of pretty much anyone in any position of power to be able to state any of this plainly. And here now, at the end of the game, instead of getting paid money for your photos, you're earning retweets and reblogs, documenting the protest and getting the message out. And instead of getting razzed for taking photos of blue bottles, you get a penalty for taking photos of people's faces at a protest. Here in its last moments, the macro DLC shows a sliver of optimism, that the framing of a photo doesn't just have the ability to hide the truth, but also to focus on and broadcast the truth in the name of social change. But just as quickly that optimism fades when, after completing your goals and heading to the statue at the center of the courtyard to complete the level, the world goes dark. The artificial sky shuts off and begins broadcasting warning messages. Then a huge figure erupts from the ground a few blocks away, one of the mechs that had been defending the city from the kaiju at the end of the game. And as it bends down, its eyes red and unblinking and somehow contemptuous, you realize it isn't responding to a kaiju attack. The system that will ultimately fail to protect its citizens is also more than happy to use its weapons against them. Smoke bombs burst out from behind you in the protest, and militarized police with riot shields and batons begin attacking the protesters en masse. When you reawaken, your friends have dragged you to a rooftop. The area of the protest is full of fire and craters. There isn't much left. You walk towards a tunnel and away from the underground city, and presumably ultimately end up on a rooftop surface to await the end of the world. Unlike the main game, the credits for the DLC don't feel wistful or sad. They list the amount of resources spent fighting people who wanted to live safely, people who wanted to see violence and oppression ended. And this is what the system was doing with its resources while it lost a battle to save the world. Umurangi Generation shows a neoliberal world that perceives requests for social or economic change as an existential threat that warrants the same response as a literal apocalypse, because to neoliberalism, it is. To prevent that shitty future is to break from neoliberalism, and that's a worldview that neoliberalism itself can't countenance. It believes there is no situation it can't neoliberal its way out of, which is how you get sending mech after mech even after it's proven ineffectual. It's also how, in the real world, you get eventually market pressure will make it profitable enough for us to science our way out of climate disasters, so don't worry about it. And it's how you get where we are right now in America, where we're sending kids to school to catch COVID en masse as our hospitals overflow and unemployment benefits and eviction moratoriums expire because, hey, didn't you hear? The pandemic's over. And the people making these decisions don't even hide it. This famous clip of Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is from the summer of 2020, before a vaccine was even available.
And we're locked down, and we're crushing the average worker. We're crushing small business. We're crushing the markets. We're crushing this country. And what I said when I was with you that night, there are more important things than living. And that's saving this country for my children and my grandchildren, and saving this country for all of us. And I don't want to die. Nobody wants to die. But man, we gotta take some risk and get back in the game and get this country back up and running.
Umurangi Generation is perhaps one of the most resonant games about the times we're living in I've ever played. It manages to crystallize much of the dysfunction that drives the world today, and it does so in a way that feels natural. It isn't sanctimonious or condescending, it simply presents a world going through much of what we're going through, but different. We may have fewer giant mechs and kaiju attacks and underground cities with digital skyboxes, but often enough, our skies are just as red.